two, one. Change Everything Live with me, Andre Bailey, here today with Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer. Mayor, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Andre. How about you?
Good seeing you.
I hadn't seen your office as a studio before. So
I know, right? It's fancy. It's amazing how easy it is to turn anything into a TV studio with how cheap these TVs are, and these graphics were like $200, so it's great. Filming right here in downtown Orlando. As always, if you're watching this in another television market or watching on Apple iTunes or YouTube Live, you're going to see a shorter version of this interview on CBS, but the entire interview's on Apple and iTunes. So, Mayor, how's life? How's things going?
Life is good.
What's it like being the mayor, one of the longest, we were talking before we started, you're one of the longest tenured mayors in America.
Well, I like to tell my other mayor friends, and I'm very active in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, so I have friends all around the country, but I like to tell them that I'm the happiest mayor in America, and they're, oh, come on, how can you be the happiest mayor? And then I start talking about Sunrail, about our venues, about Medical City, about Creative Village, and they say, okay, we kind of get it. Your city's on a roll, and it's a good time to be the mayor of this great city.
When you started out as mayor, gosh, all those years ago, how do you see the community being different today than it was when you started? What are the biggest changes in the community?
Well, there's been a lot of growth, and I would say, although we've always been an accepting community, I think we have come to embrace diversity, equality, fairness for all in a more passionate way, perhaps, than we did in 2003. So I think we've grown into a community that is very welcoming. It's a community you don't have to be third generation to pretty much be involved in anything that you want to be involved in. You know, there's some other communities, if you weren't a member of the such and such country club and your grandfather was one of the founders, it'd be hard for you to be president of the EDC or the chamber or something like that. But we're a community that I'd say probably 15-20% were born outside the United States even. So there's not that many like you and I that actually grew up here, and well, I was born a mile from where we are right now.
You were born at Orlando Health down the road, or Florida Hospital?
Well, it was Orange Memorial Hospital.
So your parents lived in Osceola County, came up here to the big
Since
hospital in Orlando.
I'm a hair older than you, and we'll concede, Andre and I both graduated from the same high school.
Osceola High School.
Cowboys with a K. A few years different, but back then I was born in 58. You were either born at home or you drove up to Orlando. So most of the babies that were born in Kissimmee at that time were born at Orange Memorial.
Wait, born at home. What do you mean by that? People would give birth?
Midwives, yeah.
Okay, in their home. Okay, so you.
There was not a hospital where you could go to be born.
That's fascinating. So what was it like being growing up in Osceola County? You spent a lot of time playing sports. Is that where you honed your leadership skills?
Well, I was pre-Disney in Osceola County, so Kissimmee was about 3,500 people, and St. Cloud was about 1,500, and the whole county was about 7,500. So there were 10 times more cows than there were people. And Vine Street, which is 192, was a two-lane road. My home was actually on Vine Street in the big commercial district now. So it was quite a bit different, and I ended up going to an Ivy League school. So I went from a community where I knew one Hispanic kid my whole life, and think about how Osceola has changed at this point. It's a majority Hispanic. But I went from that small town flavor to Brown University, so it was quite a cultural shock for me. And I was graduated in 76, so I was in the era of the big hair, and you've probably seen pictures of that. Bernie from room 222 or Lamont Sanford, any of those guys would be jealous of the afro that I had.
Did you measure the afro back then? Did you get the circumference measured at the time?
It was as big as anybody else in high school, that's for sure.
So how's your hair different now? Is it just over time that it's
No, it's
straightened?
still coarse. It's just not as long. And
so if you grow it out, it would absolutely
pick it out, throw it out. I don't know. I've got more gray in it, so the texture. I didn't know we were going to get into this conversation, but the texture.
Hey, this is
of
what
your
the
hair,
show's about: is the afro that the mayor could grow out if he wanted to.
But the texture of your hair when it turns gray, and a lot of people think I just dye the gray in so that I look more distinguished or mature, but that's actually true gray. I don't dye it. But the texture changes a little bit. So I don't know what it would look like, quite honestly, if I grew it out.
So, Mayor, you grew up in this small town, Kissimmee, in Osceola County, and you really, work your tail off in both sports and you do really well in school, well enough to get into an Ivy League college. What was your inspiration? How did you get that? We both recently saw Hamilton, and we had Nick Walker on the show last week, who played Aaron Burr, and I watched that play, and I think, look at the dedication of this guy. Look at the hard work he puts in. He wrote like he was running out of time. Where did you get your motivation to work as hard as you have?
Andrae, I think it was innate because my parents didn't go to college. Probably at that time, 15% of my high school class would have went on to college, so it wasn't drilled into you. And my guidance counselors at the time, I didn't know that maybe you should apply to 3 or 4 Ivy League schools because you might get into one and not get into the other. I just kind of categorized them, and I did one from each category. So I did Brown from the Ivies, and then Georgia Tech and Clemson, Florida, and Lehigh. Unfortunately, got into all of them, and I think in some part because of all the extracurricular stuff. My grades were good, and my SAT was good, but I also played football, baseball. Believe it or not, I did theater. Speaking of Hamilton. Nothing as prestigious as that, and I certainly was not a lead singer in any of the musicals that we did. They always put me in the background and actually asked me generally to lip sync as part of the chorus. But so I did theater, was president of Key Club, so had a lot of leadership roles early on, was captain of the baseball team. And I think you started to ask before about some leadership, and team sports really is a great training ground for anybody. It doesn't matter what the sport is, just having to participate and be part of something that's bigger than yourself and recognize the role that you have within a team, whether you're the offensive guard or you're the wide out or you're the defensive back, you're a piece of something that's bigger than yourself.
So sports might have played a strong role in you're saying you were always someone who, as long as you can remember, you were dedicated. If there was work to be done, you set out, you did it well. But sports helped cultivate that in you as a young man.
It did, and I was one of those kids that I couldn't go to sleep if I hadn't done my homework. I didn't ever leave my homework undone or to the next morning or come in without having done my homework. But certainly sports taught me a lot of good lessons.
So you go to Brown, and then you decide to be an attorney. Why the decision to be an attorney? What was appealing about that profession?
So at Brown, I got an engineering degree, and I practiced 4 years as an environmental engineer.
Okay.
One of the last jobs, kind of interesting, that I had was for a Mid-Florida mining company, and they were the largest producer of cat litter in the country. So they had a calcium marlinite mine in Lowell, Florida. So it's a clay material that's very absorbent, and it was also for grease absorbance. And my job when I got hired by them was to develop other environmental type of products for them. So I helped develop a soil sealant called TerraSeal that was used to cap landfills and to create artificial ponds, and it's like a clay liner.
How would you develop something like that? They would just hand it to you and say, work with a team of scientists and figure it out?
Well, it's a material that when it gets wet, it expands and will align so that it creates an impervious barrier. So we knew it had that propensity. What we didn't know was how to install it. It was more not developing the product, but developing how to do the application. So we tried different ways of mixing it, and different proportions within a square yard of soil, and that's the part that I did. And I actually spent the better part of a couple of years on landfills, actively installing the material. So I was the engineer, I was the salesperson, and I was the installer for a couple of years.
Did you enjoy that?
I actually did, and I'd gone from engineering into that job, and I'll give you a few figures. I went from making $20,000 roughly as an engineer to making about $50 and that role, and that was a lot of money. back in 1980. So I had always planned to go to law school, and I was able to save enough money to put myself through law school. So I ended up going to the University of Florida. But I applied and got accepted and then declined and did it a second time because I was doing pretty well with Mid-Florida Mining Company. And then the third time I decided, well, you know, I probably ought to go this time because they might stop accepting me. So went to law school, started in, excuse me, the fall of '84 and graduated in '87.
So Mayor Dyer started in the kitty litter hustle. Like that was your beginning.
Brand name Kitty White, if you remember. That
Absolutely.
one.
So did you guys supply just Kitty White's kitty litter, or for a bunch of companies?
I think there are a bunch of other brand names, but Kitty White's the one I remember most because it had a big share of the market at the time.
If people don't know, that's where the mayor got his start, at Kitty White.
Well, my other favorite thing to tell in terms of being a politician, my dad owned cattle trucks, so he was a cattle truck driver when I was growing up.
In Osceola County.
In Osceola, and a lot of your listeners may not know that the state of Florida is a calf-producing state. We're the largest calf producer in the country, and those calves get shipped out to the feedlots in Texas. So that's what my dad did, was a long-haul truck driver and shipped cows from Florida to Texas. So when a truck comes back from that trip, guess what? The trailer has what? Yeah, manure, cow manure. So my first job growing up was actually shoveling manure, and I like to say that helped me later in life because, you know, when you're in the legislature in Tallahassee, it's largely the same thing.
What made you, so when you got your law degree, were you like, hey, I'm going to practice law, or did you have your eyes on politics at that time?
Maybe a little of both. I moved back to Orlando specifically so I would have the opportunity to serve in an elected office. I'd offers to go to Tampa and Atlanta, and I came with a firm that I really enjoyed here in Orlando. And reapportionment came up, and I planned on practicing law the entire time, but reapportionment came up, and they added a third Senate seat in Central Florida, and I had the opportunity and good fortune to run and then win a Senate seat when I was 32.
So you, what made you want to go into politics? You're a young man. You've already, made it big in the kitty litter, industry, and no, but you had the world in front of you. Why politics? What motivated you there?
It's going to sound corny, but it's one of those things. When I went to Brown, it was the most expensive school in the country, and I came out with about $4,500 worth of debt at 3%, and I had so much scholarship money and grant money that I was able to go to a prestigious school like that, and it was mostly federal-related money. So I felt like I had some obligation to give back, and I know that's a little bit corny, but I always thought public service was a way to do that, and I was able to do both lawyering or practice law and public service for 10 years. So it worked out well for me that I was in a profession that I could practice and earn a living and also be able to be in the legislature at the same time.
So you spent 10 years in the Florida legislature?
10 years as a state senator, and I was the minority leader for 3 of those.
Wow, what was that like? How was that different than being mayor of a big city?
Totally different, And I was there during a really good period of time, although I shouldn't say that exactly because I'm a Democrat, and the Democrats went from being in the majority to the minority. But Lawton was governor for 6 years, and Jeb Bush was governor for 4 years. The year I got to the Senate, there's 40 senators in the state of Florida. There were 20 Republican senators and 20 Democratic senators. And of the 40, 19 were freshman senators. So that was probably the most unique Senate class that the state has ever had. We were unable to elect a Senate president because it remained deadlocked 2020 on that, and we eventually decided to share power during the 2-year period. There would be a Republican president 1 year and then a Democratic president the other year, and that was probably the last 2020 vote we had the entire time because you knew that if you didn't cooperate, you couldn't get anything done because it was going to be a 2020 vote. So that was probably my favorite couple years of being in the legislature. But it's totally different being a member of a 40-person body and that has 2 chambers and then has to answer to the governor as well versus being a local government official. And in the case of being the mayor, having chief executive officer types of powers and, to be able to come in and appoint police chiefs and fire chiefs and then chair the council. And the other thing is to be able to actually see the result of decisions that you're making. I can see on a daily basis the results of decisions that I make. When you're in the legislature or the Congress, it takes a lot longer for whatever legislation you pass to have an impact.
So yeah, I have a chance to talk to folks around America who are trying to make changes on issues like the environment or homelessness or even economic change. Do you feel like because of the deadlock of politics we see in state capitals around America and in D.C., that cities are the place where if you're going to make change, you've got to make it in this country? Do you feel that same way?
I absolutely do, and any mayor in America would tell you the exact same thing. We're on the front lines, whether it's climate change or other environmental issues, whether it is keeping our communities safe, whether it is being a diverse, welcoming community. Cities are there on the front line. Transportation policy, cities on the front line. So it's fun to be mayor. It's fun to be at this level of government.
Mayor, why do you think, and again, not necessarily here in Orlando, I think we get along pretty well politically in this community compared to others. Why do you think politics just over the last 10 years has become so much more divisive? Or is that, do you think it's always been divisive and we just kind of magnify it more? What are your thoughts on politics in the broadest sense in our country?
One thing that has happened is the gerrymandering of legislative and congressional districts. So you have fewer and fewer moderates, fewer and fewer people that are middle of the road.
Again, across the country.
Across the country, not just Florida, but the Congress itself. You've got to run to the right in a Republican primary. You've got to run to the left in a Democratic primary. And so many of the seats, the primary is going to be the real race. You're going to win a Democratic primary in an overwhelmingly Democratic seat and probably be a little further left than a seat that would be contestable from either side. I'd love it if every seat in America had the same number of Democrats and same number of Republicans and it was up for grabs, but they have certainly been drawn in a different way than that. If you go back to when I was in the legislature, if you took my voting record and Toni Jennings' voting record, who was president of the Senate for 4 years while I was there, she's Republican, I would guess that we didn't have a handful of votes that we differed on. But there were some other members that were a lot farther right of me and left of me that both in my party and Tony's party would have had drastically different records.
So, and again, being practical, because of that, because of the way the districts are drawn, the extremes on both sides are the only ones that are going to make it to the primaries.
The extremes, and then you see people that cater to the extremes. I'll give you a national example. Lindsey Graham has conducted himself a little differently the last year or so going into an election cycle than he had prior to that. So
he knows if he doesn't activate the base, and the base might be a little bit more to the right, then he's going to go up against someone who's going to challenge him that he's not right enough.
Yes, exactly.
In the same way that, and I always say her name wrong, the woman from New York, the young woman, Ascasia, am I saying that right?
Close enough.
Okay, sorry. She, again, all what's right or wrong aside, she's much further left than the Democrat that she beat out. And so now when that seats up for re-election, it's going to be who is more the winner of the winner is often going to be the person who goes left or right. And you're saying that's the seats that are drawn up that are causing that to happen.
And there's just more and more of that. So
Okay.
that lends itself to being certainly more divisive or not being able to come together.
In Orlando, it seems like we've been able to avoid that tremendously partisan vibe. I actually think, not just because you're here, I think you've been a really big part of that. How have we escaped some of the polarization here in Central Florida that has happened around America?
You know, Andre, I think we take it a little bit for granted how collaborative and cooperative we are as a region. You go to other areas of the country, and the city and the county are fighting, or counties are fighting against each other. We don't have a whole lot of that. We might have a little bit here and there, but for the most part, we work really well together. And the university, as under Dr. Hitt's leadership, really established itself as a partnership university. And the city and the county have worked together. And I think in some part it goes all the way back to getting the medical school when the community came together to help UCF convince the Board of Governors and the governor and the legislature to locate the medical school. And we've just learned to work together on a whole variety of issues, Sunrail, the venues. So the business community works really well with the local governments, with the not-for-profits, with our faith community, translated into obviously homelessness, and all the same people that worked on venues or worked on Medical City were at the table to work on the issue of chronic homelessness. So as a region, we just haven't thought in terms of Democrats and Republicans. We've thought more in terms of, here's a vision, how do we get this big thing done?
Yeah, I've often thought, Florida is the second most transient state in the union behind Nevada and Orlando. A lot of people from all over the place. You're a Central Florida guy. You're one of the few maybe that started here and now is a Central Florida leader. At times I've thought, we're a bunch of people from a bunch of places, and we've got to figure out how to work together, or we can't really get anything done. And I think, again, you have set the pace when it comes to collaboration. As a Democrat, you've done something I also think is pretty unique. You work really well with business leaders. I mean, again, in the theory of politics, the business community and those on the left are always supposed to be opposed to each other. Well, it's just how it plays out in the theater of politics nationally. But you have always been someone who's been able to work well with the business community, even though you're a Democrat and you're on the left. How do you bridge that gap? How have you always done it?
I guess there's a recognition that when we talk about jobs, it's businesses that create the jobs. So how can you be against business if you're for people? I hadn't really thought about that, Andre, but I do remember one year in the legislature where I was the #1 ranked senator for Associated Industries, which represents the business community, and the #1 ranked senator for labor. So that's kind of hard to do, to be #1 on both the labor side and the business side, but they cared about different values and different issues, and I happen to be good for them on both of those. But I'm for pretty much everybody, and our business community is really a large part of who we are in Central Florida.
When you think about, sometimes again I make these assumptions, when you go into in 2019 or in 2015 or whatever year you're presiding as the mayor of the city of Orlando, do you kind of just say, hey, listen, we've got to build these venues, and this is the problem, that these venues need to be built or rebuilt? Who's going to help me get that done? Is it more practical to you, collaboration at times, that you see that without the business community and without sometimes even the faith community or others, that you can't bring in this community the political will or the resources to get to bear? Is sometimes collaboration, putting it differently, the practical need to solve a problem?
That's absolutely right. I mean, okay, let's just take the venues, for instance. Very complicated deal. We knew that if we were going to build 3 venues, we were going to have to use tourist development tax in some fashion. City of Orlando doesn't control the tourist development tax. Orange County does, and the tourism community has the largest voice in how tourist development tax is used. So going and getting Disney and Universal and Hotel and Lodging Association on board to spend some tourist development tax in downtown on venues is important. So maybe there's collaboration by necessity is what you're suggesting. But then you need all types of people on board. And one of the reasons we put that venue package together the way we did is we brought the arts community and the sports community and the entertainment community all together, because different parts of that supported different pieces. So some people were supporting the Citrus Bowl, some people were supporting having the new arena, and some people were supporting the Performing Arts Center. So it was better to have it as one package than competing against each other.
When the traveling road show for Hamilton came into town recently, I saw you were there. Did you have a moment where you looked around and thought, "This is why we built these venues"? Was there that?
I have that moment every time
Okay.
I walk in the Performing Arts Center. I was at the opening of the Impact Forum, Lake Nona Impact Forum, last night. We opened the windows up in the DeVos room, and it was a ooh, and there were a lot of people that hadn't been in downtown Orlando before. So it's great to be able to take somebody there for the first time and have them experience Orlando in that way when they're from New York or LA, and they're like, oh, this couldn't be Orlando, but it is Orlando. And then the Amway Center is the best in the country. So we
Go
can be
Magic.
proud. And one change I would say, Andrae, since 2003, while I'm thinking about that, is the publisher of the newspaper, when I first became mayor, told me she thought that we had a little bit of an inferiority complex, that we didn't always strive to be the best or the greatest. And I think that's totally changed, that here in Orlando now, we believe that anything that we do, we can be world class or the best in class, however you want to put it. And there's just example after example after example.
Mayor, how important is the University of Central Florida to this region? It's been around a while, and its growth has been just meteoric. How important is the University of Central Florida to this community and to its future?
Well, I'd say it's our number one asset, because if you're going to be successful in the future, you have to be able to attract and retain or create talent. And the University of Central Florida is our talent creator. And if you think of what they've done over the course of time, what are industries? Tourism. So they create the Rosen School, biomedical. So we do the medical school, modeling, simulation, and training. They have the Simulation Institute. We want to get into a cluster of digital media companies. They create the Florida International Entertainment Academy, and they're going to bring the campus that'll open in August downtown with 7,000 students. So that's critical to the continuing growth of our downtown. So I would say that the University of Central Florida is our single biggest asset. Put the airport right behind that, and then of course our tourism community as a whole right there as well. But we had a legislator suggest, he says facetiously, but I don't know whether it was or not, a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan to shut the university down.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, I couldn't even imagine our community without the University of Central Florida, and why it's different than a lot of places. And I like to tell my mayor friends too, it's really cool to be mayor of a city that's growing and still finding its identity. Because if you're the mayor of Boston or Philadelphia, they're kind of already what they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Orlando is still trying to figure out exactly what it is that we're going to be in the future, but we're going to be part of that future. But big cities like that, I don't know how many universities Boston has. I think I heard the mayor there say 20 just in the city, and like 50 within the region or some number like that. We don't have a large number of universities. We started late, so one of the reasons that UCF has grown so large, it's meeting the needs of what in another community might be 10 different colleges or universities. So it is critical to our future.
Mayor, how do we, with all these young folks going to UCF, how do we keep these kids when they get out of UCF? I think that's something I hear a lot of leaders talking about, that we can bring people here, whether it's tourism on one side or folks coming here for education. But what's the secret for the next 5-10 years and beyond for us to keep talent, and especially young people here? What do we need to do better?
There's a couple things. It's having the career paths and opportunities is certainly critical. If you want to be somebody that makes video games, if there aren't companies that make video games in Orlando, then you're going to go somewhere else. But we have companies that make video games, so that student or that young person can stay here and have a career in that industry. I just picked that as an example. But then the other thing is, when I talk about the venues, or I talk about Sunrail, or some of the things we're doing to improve our downtown, that's part of our economic development strategy because if you're a young person that can live anywhere in the country, and we're a pretty mobile society now, if you want to live in a city that has a major league soccer team or has professional sports or has a world-class performing arts center, we're your city now. If we didn't have some of those assets, then it would be harder to attract that talent. And a lot of the talented young people want to live in a downtown environment. And 20 years ago, we didn't have anywhere really to live in downtown. And now we've got a lot of different options for people to live in our downtown. And then the other benefit that we have with our downtown is because we grew up later, we have all these great single-family neighborhoods surrounding our downtown. In about a 10-minute walk, you can walk from your office to Delaney Park or College Park or Thornton Park or Audubon Park. So having that close proximity is great for retaining and attracting talent as well.
Does culture and coolness matter in keeping young folks? What do you think?
Absolutely it does. And one of the indicators is whether you have a lot of live music or not. Believe it or not, I mean, just
I agree.
some of the things, and we have a lot of live music between Disney, Universal, but then just in downtown, and people are creating more opportunities, Plaza Live. So every time I turn around, there's a different venue opening up to offer that type of thing. So we're going to rival Austin in that regard soon.
Hey, listen, we don't want to be weird, but we want to be cool. So, Mayor, you've been the mayor through some really good times. You've also been mayor through some very challenging times. We've had some storms hit us. We've had the Pulse tragedy. What was the most difficult day for you as mayor of the city of Orlando?
Pulse, for sure, June the 12th, 2016. Nobody wants to have their community go through something like that. And unfortunately, it seems like every week now there is another mass shooting of some sort. And we continue to reach out to other communities, Pittsburgh, Las Vegas, to assist them in any way we can, because unfortunately we have some expertise in what to do after in terms of victims assistance and how to rally your community to get together. But June the 12th was something that prior to that day, I couldn't even have imagined going through something like that. But in that same regard, it was the worst day in the history of our city. But I couldn't be more proud of our city and how resilient we were and how we united together to support the victims, to support the families, and to support each other. And how the world, the country, and really the world rallied around with love. And, we've had so many of these mass tragedies. It seems like people rallied around Orlando in that particular incident. I can't explain why, but it seems like more so than just about any of them. You saw the Eiffel Tower and bridges in London and the Sydney Opera House in Australia lit up in rainbow colors to support Orlando. So we try whenever we can to pay it forward and try to help other communities.
Where were you? Tell me where you were when you got the call, and what were those first few hours like?
So it was a Saturday night in early Sunday morning, actually, when it occurred. I'd gone to bed fairly early, so I got a call, and it was from Deputy Chief Bobby Anzueto, and he said, Mayor, it's Deputy Chief, I have to inform you that there's been a shooting at the Pulse nightclub. There's multiple casualties. It's turned into a hostage situation, and we've set up the command center on Orange Avenue. Your police liaison is on the way to pick you up.
So that in the first hour, it's still roughly?
Yeah, it was a little before 3. So the initial shots were, I think, 2:06. So it would have been about 45 minutes into it. So my first inclination was to call my older son, who at that time was 26 and lives here in Orlando, because I didn't know if he'd ever been to Pulse or not, but it was the type of club that he could have been. It was a very welcoming place, and I just want to make sure he was home. The 1 in a million chance that somehow he might be at that club. I needed to know one way or the other, and he picked up, so he was home asleep in bed, so that made everything else I had to do a little bit easier for me on a personal manner, and I thought about what we were going to do, and I didn't know what the circumstances were, right? So, but I did know my job would ultimately be largely in the communication area. I wasn't going to go take out the bad guys or anything like that. So I picked up my communication person, Deputy Chief of Staff Heather, and we made our way down to the command center. And when I got there, they updated me on everything that was occurring, and we had talked about on the way there, what is my role? So number one was to stay out of the way and not hinder law enforcement. Two was support the chief's line of command in every way that I could. And then number three was to gather as much information as I could so that we could decide how to convey information when that time was appropriate. So we went through the evening, and in the 5 o'clock hour, we breached, well, we could spend a 2-hour segment on everything that occurred that night, but the gunman was eventually pinned down in a bathroom, and there were bathrooms across the hall from each other. So a north bathroom where he was with some hostages, and a south bathroom that the hostages couldn't get out of without him seeing across the hallway. So we eventually, the chief made the decision to breach the wall with...
And you're in the command center at this time?
We're in the command center. In the command center, there's the chief and 2 of his deputy chiefs, 3 sheriffs, the FDLE, the FBI, and I thought it was pretty calm, and they told me later they thought it was chaotic, but from a layman's point of view, I thought that the interaction of all of the law enforcement there was pretty incredible in the support of the chief. He made that decision, breached. Gunman eventually comes out, shoots at SWAT. SWAT kills gunman. He goes down. The gunman had been in contact with 911 and hostage negotiators throughout the course of the evening, had declared his allegiance to ISIS, but it also said that he had bombs similar to what had been used in, I think it was Paris, so flak jacket type of bombs. And a couple of the hostages had been texting saying he has bombs, because I think later we figured out that they had just overheard him telling the hostage negotiator about the bombs and didn't actually see any bombs. But there was a sign that had fallen off of the wall next to his body, and it looked like some type of device because it had wires. So the immediate first thought was he had wired bombs to himself, and there might be explosives in there. So we couldn't immediately go to a press conference because we didn't know if there were, in fact, explosives in the building or his car, which was in the parking lot, because we didn't think we could instill comfort and calm if you had a car blow up in the background while you're doing the first press conference. But we had quite a discussion with the FBI and the FDLE about what all this was going to look like. And initially, I should mention, since he had declared his allegiance to ISIS, the second the shooter was dead, the FBI said, we're in charge now.
Immediately.
So we had been in charge up to 5:15, and then the FBI was in charge. So that is when it became a discussion about how the press conferences are going to go. And initially they wanted to lead out, and we convinced them that it was a better idea to have the local mayor who's elected and known by the community, rather than as great a guy as the FBI agent in charge would have been a total unknown face coming out at the very first instance to tell people what had gone on. So what we wanted to do was have me be the face of it to begin with, and then to convey accurate information to calm everybody down and let them know that they were safe. And we did a lot of stuff by instinct that turned out to be the right thing. I've learned a lot about emergency response since then. But one of the things we did is came out and said we're not going to be defined by the act of a hate-filled killer. We're going to be defined by our response.
Right up
our
front.
response is going to be with love, with compassion, and with unity. And that was the message that all of Orlando gravitated to.
Yeah, the moment that just sticks out in my mind the most about the first few hours is you come to the podium. It's 9, 10 o'clock. It could have been earlier. The first press conference, it was light out, and you're talking about what happened, and you go and you say the number of victims.
That was the second press conference.
Okay, and I've seen you do a lot of press conferences. I've seen you at 100 events, and you're reading a statement, and you say the number, and your voice just cracks, and you stop. Do you remember that?
Absolutely.
What was the emotion at that moment?
That was the toughest public moment I've had in my entire career in any possible way, because what had happened was we only had anecdotally guesstimates at what the numbers of casualties were. So when we walked out for the first press conference, one of the officers that had been inside said there was at least 20 dead. But we didn't know how many people were dead.
Could have been less, could have been more, but you didn't know.
Just somewhere in that general range. So we weren't going to give a number at the first press conference, because I thought it was critically important that whatever information we're conveying is accurate, not something that we're guessing at or speculating about. So we got to the end of that press conference, and we were doing Q&A, and one of the reporters asked the chief, "I understand that there are 20 dead, is that right?" And the chief said yes, which was accurate, because there were 20 at least. So I turned around and walked and grabbed the chief as we were walking away, and I said, "We have to figure out what the real number is and be able to convey that at the next press conference, and we're not going back out until we know that." Well, unfortunately, they had determined that. Heather came walking toward me. She was all white-faced and said, "We just, while you were out here, been able to determine that it's 50 that are dead." So having to convey that, and I just looking at the very seasoned media people that were there, you could see in their faces it was they all took a deep breath too. So it wasn't just me, but that was probably the most difficult news I've ever had to deliver.
Mayor, going through that, what is the advice that you give leaders in other communities, mayors in other communities that go through a tragedy like this?
Have a communication plan. So some are practical things. Like a mistake we made day one was where we set up a reunification center that was accessible to the press, and victims' families were being harassed as they were trying to come in and find out information. So we moved over to Camping World Stadium. That's information I conveyed to Las Vegas in the first phone call. The mayor of Las Vegas, a good friend of mine, and I got her early that morning and just said that to her. We actually ended up sending our team out to Las Vegas, and they helped run their Victims Assistance Center for about 10 days out there. So I give them some practical advice, but it's have a communications plan. And, it's small little things. We had done a charrette. We always do a tabletop exercise, emergency management exercise every year. In happenstance, we're usually doing hurricane simulations. We did a civil disobedience exercise and figured out some social media protocols so that when we were conveying information, if it's a natural disaster, it would come from the mayor's office, all the social media, and everybody else could only put out the information that came from our social media feeds. But if it's a crime event, then we're going to do it from OPD. So nobody else was allowed to put out information that had not been put out by OPD.
That's important.
And then we got our sister and brother agencies to do the same. And then we monitored TV and social media to correct as quickly as we could misinformation that was out there. So communication is one part of it. And then on a personal level, about a week after Pulse had occurred, a friend of mine who's a counselor called and say, "Hey, just want to check in on you to see how you're doing." And I said, I'm doing okay, but I don't feel the emotion that I think I should be feeling right now. And she said, well, that's actually good because you're leading our community and you can't be having emotion that keeps you from doing your job. You have to do your job. And I told that to my staff when we were doing a joint counseling session. And 3 or 4 of them said, thank you for telling me that, Mayor, because I feel the exact same way. I feel like I don't feel as sad as I need to feel about this situation. And but it was true. They were all still doing their jobs because so many of my direct staff ended up operating the emergency reunification or assistance center, I guess, transformed into the assistance center.
But as time went on, it was important to have, you guys had therapists then who worked with your team, law enforcement, and others, correct?
Yeah, not just for the firefighters and the police officers that had been involved directly, but people who were meeting with victims or their families for weeks on end. You know, that takes a real toll when you're trying to help people get through it as well. So yeah, we've done a lot of care for all of our employees.
I want to make sure to get you out of here on time, Alex. Okay. Making sure that we don't run over your time. You're very, very busy. Mayor, where do we go from here as a community? What are 2 or 3 things that are incredibly important for the city of Orlando to be all that it can be, in 2019, but 2020, 2025, beyond?
We're rocking in terms of construction and new development. The areas that concern me, what keeps me up at night, is affordable housing and housing for everyone that is coming here. We're leading the country in job growth and population growth. So making sure that somebody that's not making as much money as you do, Andrae, has a place to live is one of the things that, and we're not alone in that issue. It's a crisis all over the state and all over the country in terms of affordable housing. Homeless continues to be an area that concerns. And then the other one is one that you're involved in, is the opioid issue. And I congratulate you, or commend you, I guess would be a better term, for being active with Florida Blue and helping bring the community together on that issue, because it's just amazing to me. Virtually every person I talk to has somebody they know that's been affected by addiction.
Yeah, the opioid crisis is mind-blowing in that we did that launch of Project Opioid, where our leaders, if you're not from Central Florida, have come together to try to fight addiction, help people that are addicted to these drugs, and reduce opioid deaths. And I had never seen anything like it. Almost every person who got up as a leader to speak, Dick Batchelor gets up and tells a story of his sister that died of overdose and addiction, and he had never told that story publicly before. So it is one of those issues where it's a no-brainer, in that when you see that many people losing their lives and it impacting so many families, I think all of us just say, hey, how can we be a part of this solution there? I think it's also a challenge because it started in our institutions. It started with doctors. It started with pharmaceutical companies, and it's not people from the wrong side of the track scoring illegal drugs as a starting point. Do you think that makes the opioid crisis more challenging, kind of its genesis?
Well, I think the thing that has struck me is the recognition that it's a disease. I mean, people having cancer are a disease. People having an addiction is a disease, but they're not treated the same. And there was a father that started one of the national groups that told his story about his son having an addiction issue and his son's best friend having some form of cancer, and how the entire community rallied around the child that had cancer, and were doing bake sales, and anytime he came home from radiation or whatever treatments he's having, everybody was there to embrace him, whereas his son was an outcast and was embarrassed by the fact that he had the issue, and then depression set in, and a bad result there. So I think our number one piece of this is to have everybody understand that it is an illness, it's a disease, and it needs to be treated as such, and people need to be encouraged to come forward with their disease.
Yeah, whether, as we wrap up, whether it's chronic homelessness or the opioid crisis or a lot of folks struggling in poverty in our community, we're still working on that, like most communities in America. You know, turning away, there's that old puritanical idea that if you do good, good things happen to you and you shouldn't have problems. But if you have bad things happen to you, obviously you've done something wrong and it's your fault. Both with the opioid crisis, chronic homelessness, we've had to take a closer look, and we're still doing that, and say, hey, maybe this person, it isn't necessarily about a blame game. It's about us as a society thinking in a more evolved way when someone's struggling. Or they've got this challenge, but why? Why are they struggling?
And just recognizing it as an issue that is just as important to us as whether the Magic make the playoffs.
Boy, we're all praying there, aren't we? Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer, one of, if not the longest termed mayor in a big city in America. Thank you for coming on. We're going to bring you on again and talk for 2 hours. I know you've got a busy schedule. And if you want to follow the mayor on social media, we'll put all of his social media links on. If you saw just a small part of this on CBS, you can watch the entirety of the episode on Apple iTunes as a podcast or YouTube Live for the entire 1 hour interview. Mayor, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Andrae.
We'll see you soon.